When I got out of prison, I went to stay with a friend for a few months. My friend, he had mental health problems as well. I ended up leaving and not staying there because of the situation, and I was homeless. And I was sleeping rough at the back of Argos in town. Literally, I'd get into a hostel, I'd be there for, say, 28 days, and there wouldn't be no hostel spaces anywhere else because the services were starting to get cut. I just liked that lifestyle because I had no responsibility. My drug addiction was so bad. I mean, I'd gone from being in prison, and after doing a sentence like that, after 19 and a half months of being in prison and using drugs, you get the mentality, well, if that's the worst that they can do to me, bring it on. If that's as bad as it gets, I don't care. And I didn't. I was committing crime, doing it, thinking, well, if I do get caught, at least I'm not going to be on the street. At least I'll be able to address my drug problems. And also, with me being mentally ill, I'd not talked about it. I still hadn't, at this point, told people, you know, this is what's going on. I was using the drugs as well to numb out all that pain and all the mental health aspect. I started to get deeper and deeper into my addiction, where I was buying amounts and I started actually selling those kind of drugs, whereas before I was just using them. And it's a whole different ball game. You've got people that will put knives to you. I've had people try to cut me up. I've had knives at my throat. It's really dodgy. I felt more safe in prison than what I did on the street. You've got category A prisons, and they're harder to get drugs in because they're more secure. But I only ever went to cat B and cat C category prisons because of the crimes that I did and the short sentences. So unless you was lifed off, you wouldn't see a cat A prison. But when I got sent to a cat D prison, where you're supposed to have more freedom and they're supposed to rehabilitate you to get out, I was basically, it was like living in a crack house. So after about 2 months of being in a cat D prison, when they drug tested me, they found out I was using drugs, and they sent me back to a cat C. It all fell apart. So again, I'm in a cat C. Drugs are harder to get and they're expensive, so I stopped, but I'm still suffering with my mental health. But to me, prison was like home now. It was better than being on the street. I knew where my food was coming from. I was getting 3 meals a day. I had a roof over my head. And that went on for years. I was in and out of prison on little sentences. And then when I got my big 6, that was the sentence that changed me. Before I knew it, I'm to where I am today. 20 odd years had gone by, nearly 24 years. You'd go to the doctor and you'd tell the doctor I'm suffering with addiction, or you'd go to a service and all they'd offer you is methadone at the time. And that was it, there was no other option. So I actually got addicted to methadone and heroin. It never stopped my heroin use. And you'd give them drug tests, they'd keep you going with methadone for say a year, and because of the drug tests they'd say, look, we've got to let you go because you're not sticking to your plan. All you do is re-register. 2 weeks later you'll be back in front of the doctor, so you'd only have to maintain your habit for 2-3 weeks, and then you give them a drug test. When it comes back positive, they give you methadone again. And I got addicted to methadone. I spent 14 years on methadone and heroin and using crack, with in the back of my mind thinking, well, if it goes wrong, I'll go prison and I'll get clean. But no, they offered me methadone. I couldn't believe it. I got caught for the worst burglary I could have done. I stole like 3 shotguns and 300 rounds of ammunition. Through DNA I got caught, and I'd done loads of burglaries and I didn't care, and all of those got wiped away. But because they had DNA on this one burglar, and me being a bit arrogant, I was offered 3.5 years to go guilty, and I didn't take it. I was like, no, I'll take it all the way, because I thought they didn't have enough to convict me, but they did, and I was blind to myself. That's how deep in my addiction I was. And I thought, go in prison, at least I'll get clean, and then I can have another life when I get out. It was the first time, 20 odd years had gone by. I'm now nearly 40 years old. And I was just looking around in the cell and I thought, is this what you want for the rest of your life? Prisons at that time were being sold off privately as well. And before that, they were run by governments. People who were getting sent to these private prisons were running rings around the prison officers because they didn't know, nothing about security or about how prisons are run. So there was a lot of mobile phones coming in prisons, drugs getting in prison at the time, and this was all being kept away from the public. They didn't even want the public to know that they were selling the prisons off. And I started to realise what was going on around me. For the first time, spoke to counselling services in prison, and you got like Carrot's team that deal with drug offenders or people that are in prison for drugs. And I spoke to them and I opened up for the first time. I do suffer with my mental health and I know I need help. And I didn't want that lifestyle no more. I knew I'd have to do a lot of work to get to that point. So I started seeing a counsellor, but there's no psychotherapy in prisons. So I'd just be speaking to a counsellor and there'd be no real progress. You just get to talk to someone and that was it. And I said to them, I need proper mental health worker. Oh, we don't do that, you can't get that. I was like, okay. And when it comes down to drugs, when they're offering you methadone or they're offering you medications, most prisoners have now not got an incentive and they don't care if they get caught, because their attitude is, well, if I get caught doing anything, I'll get my methadone when I go police station, or I'll get my methadone when I go prison. So they're not bothered. They created a real monster. Well, that's the other thing as well. The Human Rights Act came out. So in one sense, it's wrong if somebody's in medication and somebody's in treatment and then it's suddenly took away from them. Yeah, it's not a good thing. People should be allowed to access treatment if they're given that treatment on the outside. But before this, they never used to do it, and it was only when a few prisoners sued the prison service that they changed and they started giving people methadone, and I thought it was crazy. People have got no incentive to get clean, and if they're outside, they don't care about what crimes they commit because they'll get their medication when they go to prison. So I was shocked. I was like, it never used to be like this. So I had to make a conscious choice to get clean when I did. I was given a chance again to go Cat D, and while I was there, I discovered the only reason the prison before had given me Cat D for my last 3 months was because they didn't want the responsibility of housing me. They're responsible for what your release, where you go and how you're housed. I've not been done for any violent offences. I wasn't given any conditions to you get a licence, which is, it's called, you do half your prison sentence and then you do the rest on licence in the public. So they're supposed to set up somewhere for you to go to live. Well, the Cat D was in the right mess because they were like, we don't know what to do with you. Have you got somewhere to go when you leave prison? The prison officer told me we'd have to release you and you'd be homeless. And if you've got bail conditions or certain conditions, then that can affect your bail or your licence and you could be recalled back to prison. I've got out of prison, straight away I'm given a script. So now I've got a prescription. I've got way more drugs than I need on this prescription. And that was the hardest part, was making a conscious choice to change, but then trying to access the services to make that change. And that's where I got failed. And this is when I made the biggest change in my life. I admitted for the first time that I was suffering with mental health and that a lot of my drug use was self-medication. I was self-medicating to take that pain away from all the stress of having guns put at my head, from being sexually abused and psychologically and physically abused at home. When I was in a children's home, like I said earlier, I'd been abused by one of the members of staff. I remember when I was in the children's home, just before I left, this is when I was 15, a guy came round and he was all suited up. He looked like a business guy, and straight away he was like, I'm investigating Frank Beck and I'm investigating sex abuse allegations. I'm also a very good friend of Greville Janner. And do you know who Greville Janner is and that? And I was like, no, why? And he's like, he's a politician and he's well respected. And he said, we've got a bit of a problem at the moment. And he said to me, you're a good kid, aren't you, Michael? And he said, because these kids that are making these allegations, when it comes to light that they're telling lies, we're going to put them all in secure units. And they'll be there until we decide, and until they start telling the truth, that they weren't abused. So I was in shock, and I thought, I'm not saying anything. You know, I was 15 years old, I was scared. I thought, if I say something now, they're going to say, you're one of these lying kids, and secure units. I heard of kids being put in secure units, and some of them never get out. They've got you, that's it. So I was scared.